An ambulance rushing to save 5-year-old Joshua was blocked by a man in a fake uniform claiming to enforce HOA rules. Terrence Bowen, a self-appointed officer, had terrorized the neighborhood for months, using a counterfeit badge to control and intimidate. But when his obsession with power cost a child's life, Joshua's father Bradley turned grief into action, and the entire community rose with him. Just wait until you see how this shocking tragedy unraveled and why justice, in the end, didn't just knock, it roared. Bradley Jennings swerved hard into his driveway, tires screeching, front bumper nearly clipping the trash bins at the curb. His hands shook on the wheel. In the back seat, 5-year-old Joshua wheezed, his breaths short and ragged, each inhale a losing battle. His face was pale, lips turning blue. Bradley reached back instinctively, touching his son's leg. "Hold on, buddy, I got you. Just breathe, okay? You're okay." He grabbed his phone with one hand, already dialing as he jumped out of the car. 911. What's your emergency? "My son, he's having an asthma attack. He needs epinephrine now. We're home. We're at 347 Greenbrier. Hurry, please." The dispatcher's voice was calm, but Bradley barely heard it. Every second was dragging Joshua closer to the edge. Slamming the door, he sprinted toward the house. The auto-injector was in the kitchen cabinet, top shelf, where Joshua couldn't reach it. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times. He was ready. He would be fast. He would save his son. He hit the front steps, reached for the door. "Excuse me, sir." A voice cut through the panic like a siren in reverse, loud, firm, and entirely out of place. Bradley turned, stunned, heart hammering. A tall man stood at the foot of his driveway, arms crossed, blocking the sidewalk like he had some sort of jurisdiction over the concrete. He wore a dark, militarized uniform with patches that read HOA Enforcement Unit in white thread. A shiny badge, plastic, Bradley would later realize, glinted on his chest. His face was stern, sunburned, and full of authority that didn't belong. "You can't park here," the man said, gesturing sharply at Bradley's SUV. "You're in violation of HOA Regulation 7.2, no curbside parking during restricted hours. This is clearly marked in your community bylaws." Bradley blinked. His brain couldn't compute what was happening. What the hell are you talking about?" He turned back toward the door, but the man stepped forward, raising a hand like he was directing traffic. "Sir, you need to move your vehicle immediately or you'll be cited." "It's my house," Bradley snapped, spinning around, eyes blazing. "My son can't breathe. I just called an ambulance." The man remained motionless. "I understand that, but rules are rules. You cannot obstruct community access. The HOA takes these matters seriously." Bradley's mouth dropped open. "Are you serious right now?" His voice cracked. "He's 5. He's turning blue in the back seat." The man didn't flinch. He pulled out a tablet, tapping on the screen with the methodical detachment. "This is your formal warning. If the vehicle is not relocated within 5 minutes, you will incur a fine. Repeat violations may result in escalation." Bradley stared at him in disbelief, his hands clenched into fists. Time was bleeding away. Joshua was inside that car, suffocating, and this guy, this idiot in a fake badge, was standing in the way like he was directing traffic at a mall parking lot. "I don't care about your citation," Bradley growled, voice low and dangerous. "Move, now." But the man didn't. He stood his ground, all authority and no soul. Bradley turned and bolted into the house, cursing under his breath. The kitchen cabinet came into view, top shelf, blue case. He grabbed the injector and sprinted back out, and as he threw open the door and reached inside for his son, the man was still there, still watching, still holding the damn tablet. Bradley didn't know it then, but the ambulance was already on its way, and it would be stuck, stalled halfway up the block, because that same HOA officer had parked his cruiser across the entrance to the street, blocking the turn-in. And Joshua didn't have that kind of time. Bradley didn't argue. There was no time to argue. He charged through the front door like a man possessed, feet slamming against the hardwood, breath ragged in his throat. The cabinet, top shelf, blue box, was already in his hand before he knew it. He spun around, heart pounding in his ears, and rushed back toward the front door. His son needed him, now. He had just reached the porch when a sound cut through the neighborhood, A rising wail, mechanical and urgent. Sirens. The ambulance. Relief hit him for a single, blinding moment, then froze in his chest. The flashing lights turned the street corner, but the vehicle slowed, then stopped, and didn't move again. Bradley blinked, stepped out further, and that's when he saw it. The faux law enforcement SUV. Black, oversized, and parked diagonally across the mouth of the driveway like a barricade. The ambulance couldn't pass. The entrance was blocked completely. He bolted down the steps and sprinted toward the street, adrenaline turning his legs into pistons. He waved his arms frantically, signaling like a madman. "Hey, here, he's inside, he's not breathing." The paramedics were already out of the vehicle, hustling toward him with equipment bags in hand, but their faces told the story, confused, frustrated, losing precious seconds. One of them yelled over the engine noise, "Can you move the car? We can't get through." Bradley turned to the man still standing beside the SUV, the so-called officer, tablet in hand, unmoved. The man glanced at the scene like he was observing a construction site delay, not a life or death crisis. "Move the damn car," Bradley roared. "My son's dying in there." The man adjusted his sunglasses calmly and said with icy precision, "I'm performing my duties under HOA regulation. Unauthorized curbside entry by emergency vehicles requires board pre-approval unless a safety liaison is present. You should have notified the HOA hotline in advance." Bradley's jaw fell open. His fists clenched. "Are you out of your mind? He's 5 years old. He needs help now." "The rules exist for a reason," the man said without blinking. "And if you had complied with the parking ordinance, none of this would be happening. I'm enforcing community standards." Enforcing community standards. Behind Bradley, the paramedics tried to squeeze around the SUV, but the space between the house and the vehicle was barely wide enough for a stretcher. One of them muttered, "This is insane," as he forced open a gate and tried to cut through the neighbor's yard. And up on the porch, in the back seat of the car, Joshua was still slumped over, his tiny body trembling, chest barely moving, lips now a sickly purple. His eyes fluttered closed. Bradley looked at his son, then back at the man. Something primal surged through his chest, a scream building in his throat. But he didn't use it. Not yet. Instead, he lunged forward, grabbing the man by the collar, slamming him back a step, just enough to break that robotic poise. "You want to write a ticket?" he snarled through clenched teeth. "Fine, you can write it in the back of the ambulance while they try to resuscitate my son." The man's expression didn't change, not once. "I am obligated to file an incident report on physical contact with HOA personnel," he said coldly. "That's assault." Bradley stared at him, disbelief turning to something darker. Because in that moment, while one man held a fake badge, a fake title, and a fake sense of power, a real child was dying 20 feet away, and the law wasn't helping. It was watching and doing nothing. 8 minutes. That's how long it took the ambulance to finally reach the front of the house after being forced to park halfway down the street. 8 minutes of detouring, maneuvering around a blockaded driveway, unloading gear in a sprint. 8 minutes too long. By the time the paramedics reached the car where Joshua lay, his tiny body was no longer moving. No crying, no flailing. Just a sickly stillness that screamed louder than any siren. His limbs were limp, his chest barely rising, each breath shallower than the last, if they came at all. The lead paramedic leaned in, felt for a pulse, then looked up sharply. "Pediatric VFib, possible respiratory arrest," she shouted to her partner. Bradley stood behind them, clutching the EpiPen like it could rewind time. "Please," he whispered, but it didn't sound like a plea. It sounded like a prayer being broken in half. The paramedics moved quickly, expertly. One administered the injection, the other began chest compressions. A third, just arriving from the rig, placed oxygen tubes against Joshua's face. The scene unfolded in rapid motion, but Bradley could only see the pale skin of his son, the way his eyelids didn't flutter, the silence where panic used to be. He stepped back onto the porch, unable to breathe. His hands gripped the sides of his head, fingers digging into his scalp like they were trying to hold his thoughts in place. This couldn't be real. His son was right there. They had the medicine. This wasn't supposed to happen. And behind him, calm as a breeze, the so-called officer resumed speaking. You'll be cited for physical aggression against an HOA enforcement officer, he said flatly, tapping away on his tablet. Interfering with official duties is a civil violation. You should consider legal counsel. Bradley didn't answer. Couldn't. His eyes were locked on the open ambulance, on the lifeless form of his child surrounded by people trying desperately to bring him back. Then a voice rang out from across the street. "Oh my God," said a woman in a floral robe, hands covering her mouth. It was Mrs. Clayton, the neighbor who always watered her lawn at sunrise. "That man isn't a cop," she said, stepping closer. "I saw him yesterday. He works security at Walmart, electronics section." The paramedics froze for just a second. One of them turned toward the man in the black uniform. "What did she say?" one of them asked. "I saw him," Mrs. Clayton insisted, louder this time. "He doesn't work for the HOA. He sells USB cables and yells at teenagers." As if summoned by the chaos, an actual police cruiser pulled up beside the ambulance. One of the paramedics had radioed in during the delay, unsure of what authority had blocked their access. A uniformed officer stepped out, approached the scene with trained, measured pace. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, scanning the tableau, the ambulance, the child, the crowd forming, and the man in the dark uniform still standing like he owned the pavement. Bradley pointed, trembling with rage. "That man blocked the ambulance. My son, he's not breathing. He said he was HOA. He wouldn't let them through." The officer walked up to the man, who immediately began reciting something about code enforcement jurisdiction. The officer held up a hand. "Let me see your ID." The man hesitated, then reluctantly handed over a plastic badge clipped to his chest. The officer examined it. His brows drew together. Then he flipped it over, checking the back. What color had been in his face drained away. "This is fake," the officer said coldly. "You are not with any official law enforcement agency. You're not HOA security. You're not even licensed." The man opened his mouth, but the officer cut him off. "Step away from the scene. You're interfering with emergency response, and you've impersonated a peace officer." Behind them, the paramedics were still working, still fighting. But no one was saying Joshua's name anymore. Only time and the sound of a father standing alone on a porch, breaking apart in silence. They told him in the hallway, not in a room, not at a table, just outside the trauma bay, beneath the low hum of fluorescent lights and the steady beep of monitors behind closed doors. A doctor in navy scrubs with tired eyes stepped forward, hands clasped tightly in front of him. No emotion, no preamble, just the truth. "It was a severe onset respiratory crisis," he said gently, "acute bronchospasm combined with oxygen deprivation. If intervention had occurred within 5 minutes of the initial collapse, there was a strong chance of recovery, but the delay was critical. I'm sorry." Bradley sat motionless on the plastic bench, fists clenched so hard the whites of his knuckles looked like bone. His body didn't react, not immediately, not in any way that made sense. The words seemed to pass through him like cold wind through broken windows. 5 minutes. 5 minutes was a traffic light. 5 minutes was a petty argument. 5 minutes was a man in a fake uniform, insisting on rules, while a child slowly suffocated in the backseat of his father's car. He stared at the floor, not moving, not blinking, just trying to remember what his son's last words were. Had he said something? Or had Bradley been too focused on the injection, on the phone call, on the damn driveway? His fists tightened again. Blood from his bitten thumbnail smeared across his palm. That night, he didn't go home. He didn't sleep. He sat in the hospital corridor until the walls started to look like they were pulsing, until the nurses no longer acknowledged him with polite nods, until grief became a dull pressure against the ribs, like a weight that couldn't be lifted. The next morning, a press release went public. The HOA of Greenbrier Estates has issued the following statement. Mr. Terrence Bowen was not, and has never been, employed or sanctioned by the association. His actions do not reflect the values or policies of the HOA. We extend our deepest condolences to the Jennings family. Bradley read it on his phone, sitting in the hospital cafeteria, coffee untouched in front of him. His eyes scanned the words over and over. Not sanctioned. Not affiliated. Does not reflect. As if removing themselves from the picture could erase the impact. But the community wasn't silent. The local news picked it up by midday. By evening, the comments were flooding in. "That guy threatened me last month for leaving my recycling bin on the curb." He said he could fine me $500 for having weeds in my flower bed. I thought he was real. He blocked my gate and said my backyard needed to be inspected. He tried to tow my wife's car, called in a private wrecker. We had to physically stop him. Each story echoed the same truth. This man had been patrolling the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff, wielding a badge bought online and rules he wrote himself. He wasn't enforcing the law, he was using it, weaponizing it. Every action cloaked in the illusion of authority, designed to control, to intimidate, to dominate. And everyone had let him, because he looked official, because he used the language of structure and consequence, because no one thought to ask who gave him that power. Until now. Now, a child was gone. No warning, no second chance. Just a tiny boy in a red t-shirt, now a statistic in an investigation that should have happened a year ago. And suddenly, the neighborhood remembered every time they had stayed silent, every time they had watched him harass someone and thought, not my problem. But it was someone's problem now. Bradley stared at the article on his screen, the scrolling comments, the image of the man in the fake HOA uniform, clipped from a doorbell camera. For Terrence Bowen, it had all been a performance, a role he played to feel powerful, a script where everyone else followed the rules he wrote. But the show was over now, and a child had paid for the closing scene. Bradley filed suit within a week. He didn't wait for grief to settle. He didn't wait for the numbness to pass or the condolences to slow. He walked into a lawyer's office with a death certificate in one hand and a tablet full of video footage in the other. There would be no forgiveness, no quiet mourning. Not this time. The case moved quickly, faster than anyone expected. The county district attorney's office reviewed the evidence and publicly announced its support. Within days, the state prosecutor stepped in. The story had drawn attention not just from local reporters, but from legal watchdog groups and child advocacy networks. People were angry. They had watched a boy die because a man with no authority played cop in a uniform bought online. The charges were severe: obstruction of emergency medical services, criminal impersonation of a public servant, unlawful detainment, and reckless endangerment of a minor. Each count carried real weight. Each carried time. This wasn't a misunderstanding, the district attorney said during the press briefing. This man wore a counterfeit uniform, carried a badge he had no right to possess, and inserted himself into a crisis where every second counted. His actions directly endangered the life of a child. This is not civil infraction territory. This is criminal. The first hearing was standing room only. Bradley sat in the front row, silent, jaw tight. He hadn't shaved in days. His suit hung on his frame like it didn't belong. In his hands, he gripped the program from Joshua's memorial service. Not because he wanted to remember, but because he refused to forget. Across the courtroom sat Terrence Bowen. He looked smaller than he had outside that day, stripped of the tactical uniform, the mirrored sunglasses, the postured dominance. He wore a cheap gray suit and sat between two defense attorneys who looked more exhausted than prepared. Still, his eyes darted around the room like he was the only one surprised to be there. When the judge asked him to speak, Terrence didn't apologize, didn't lower his head. He spoke with the same quiet conviction he'd used when issuing fake citations and barking HOA commands at neighbors. Order matters, he said. If people don't follow rules, the neighborhood falls apart. I kept things in check. I maintained discipline. That street, those people, they needed someone to keep them straight. The courtroom went still. Not a gasp, not a murmur. Just the collective realization that this man, this ordinary, unremarkable man, had built his sense of purpose entirely around control, around power. And when no one gave him any, he created it, with patches, with citations, with intimidation. He built a fantasy where he got to be the authority, where people jumped when he pointed, where fear became compliance. And in that fantasy, the cost of being wrong didn't exist. He saw himself as a protector, but not of people, of structure, of illusion, of rules that existed only in his head. Bradley didn't speak during the hearing. He didn't need to. The prosecutor's voice carried enough fire for both of them. He did not act in ignorance, the attorney said, eyes locked on the jury. He acted with deliberate deception, enforcing rules he made up, carrying a badge he purchased, and inserting himself into an emergency he had no right to interrupt. His need for control cost a child his life. Terrence didn't flinch. And that, more than anything, chilled the room. He didn't cry, he didn't rage, he didn't break, because deep down, in the quiet places no one else could reach, he still believed he was right, that without him, everything would collapse. The courtroom didn't agree, and soon the sentencing would prove it. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers and press, but with neighbors, dozens of them. Men in work boots, women in worn cardigans, teenagers who had once been told to step off the sidewalk for wearing headphones. They filled every bench, every corner of standing room. Some had come out of curiosity. Most came out of memory. When the judge called for witness statements, it didn't take long. A woman in her 30s stood from the third row. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the front. She wore a faded hoodie and held a photo in her hands. Her daughter, maybe 7 years old, smiling with 2 missing teeth. "I'm a single mom," she said. "Last winter, my daughter had a seizure. It was snowing, late at night. I was trying to get her to the hospital." She paused, eyes glassy but voice strong. "He parked across my driveway, blocked me in, said I was unauthorized to exit due to HOA street maintenance policy. I begged. I cried. He just stood there with his stupid badge and said, 'Rules are rules.'" She looked down, jaw clenched. I had to scream, like really scream, for him to move. And even then, he did it slow, like I had to earn it. The courtroom was dead quiet. Then a man in a flannel jacket rose. He didn't approach the front. He just spoke from where he stood. He used to walk the block every morning, took pictures of our license plates, especially if they were out of state. He carried a clipboard, wrote down names. My wife got a notice of violation for having a planter on the porch. Someone in the gallery muttered, "I got one too." Heads nodded. "He wasn't just annoying," the man continued. "He made us afraid. If you argued with him, he'd show up again the next day, stand across the street, stare at your house, sometimes take more pictures." "He wasn't a neighbor," said an older woman near the back. "He was a threat." One by one, more voices followed. No theatrics, no yelling, just the slow release of a fear that had gone unspoken for too long. A teenager recounted how he was accused of trespassing while delivering pizza. A couple described how their elderly mother was reduced to tears after being told her wind chimes violated noise ordinances he invented. "He treated the neighborhood like his personal fiefdom," one man said bitterly, "like we were all suspects, and he was the sheriff." The judge sat in silence throughout, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't take notes. He just listened. And through it all, Bradley sat in the front row. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He barely breathed. There were no more tears in his eyes. Those had dried days ago. What remained now was something colder, something sharper. Not vengeance, not hatred. Resolve. He didn't want to destroy Terrence Bowen. He wanted to ensure that no one else would ever have to sit where he was sitting, hands clenched on a funeral pamphlet, listening to strangers confirm what he had learned the hardest way imaginable, that everyone had seen it coming. Everyone had been touched by it, and no one had stopped it in time. So he listened, and he remembered every word, because what was happening in that courtroom wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. The courtroom was full. Neighbors packed the benches, not for drama, but because they'd waited years to be heard. The first to speak was a single mother. She clutched a photo of her daughter as she stepped forward. "Last year, my girl had a seizure," she said, voice trembling. "I tried to drive her to the ER, but he'd parked across my driveway. Said it was a violation to exit during the quiet hours. I begged him to move. He just stood there, calm, smug. I had to scream. I thought she'd die in my arms." She sat back down without another word. A man in his 40s stood next. "He took pictures of our license plates, left fake notices on our doors. My wife got fined for a flower pot. Another voice from the back. "He told me my mailbox was too short, threatened to call compliance." Then an older woman. "He called my wind chimes a disturbance and said I'd be reported. I cried that night. I actually cried over wind chimes." One by one they spoke. People who had been intimidated, humiliated, watched. People who'd been too afraid to push back. "He didn't enforce order," someone muttered. "He enforced himself." At the defense table, Terrence Bowen didn't look up. And Bradley, sitting in the front row, didn't move. His hands were clasped in his lap, his eyes locked forward. He wasn't angry anymore. He was past that. He was witnessing proof. Not just that his son's death wasn't a one-time mistake, but the result of a long, unchecked pattern of power, abused, and people silenced. The judge said nothing. He didn't have to. The silence said everything. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all 3 counts: obstruction of emergency medical services, impersonation of a public officer, and unlawful restraint. Terrence Bowen stood motionless as the judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 8. There was no reaction, no apology, just silence. His fake uniform, once a symbol of false authority, was now sealed in evidence, its patches and badge cataloged as tools of deception. His photo became more than a mugshot. It was a statewide warning, circulated to every police department: do not trust this face again. He had used illusion to control a neighborhood. Now, stripped of that illusion, he was just another inmate, one among many, but forever marked. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Microphones pushed forward. One question cut through them all. "Mr. Jennings, does this bring you peace?" Bradley paused on the courthouse steps. His eyes were tired, voice low. "No," he said, "but maybe it'll mean someone else gets their kid to the hospital in time." He walked away without another word. Justice had been served, but peace, that was never part of the sentence. 6 months later, a monument appeared at the center of Greenbrier Park. It stood modestly, just a smooth stone pedestal with a bronze plaque, surrounded by newly planted flowers and a small bench facing the playground. But the words engraved into the metal carried a weight the breeze could not move. "In memory of Joshua Jennings, may help never come too late again." People stopped when they passed it. Some bowed their heads. Others just stood silently, reading the words more than once, letting them settle. Children played nearby, unaware of the name or its meaning. But the adults remembered. They always would. It hadn't happened overnight. The community had rallied. Signatures gathered. Petitions filed. Donations collected. They didn't just want to grieve. They wanted to change something. By spring, new signs were posted in every building lobby, on every community board and mailbox kiosk. They were clear, printed in bold red type. Impersonating law enforcement, HOA officials, or any regulatory authority is a criminal offense. Violators will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about the illusion he had built and the silence that had allowed it. The story had long since outgrown the borders of their neighborhood. News outlets across the country picked it up, each headline more viral than the last. There were think pieces, TV specials, podcast episodes. Hashtags trended. People shared screenshots of the courtroom, the fake badge, the boy's photo. The comments flooded in, thousands deep. This isn't about a fake cop. It's about fake power. This is what happens when people fear uniforms more than they trust them. He wore a badge, but no heart, and the cost was a child. The phrase repeated most often was simple but true: Joshua should still be here. And while the headlines eventually faded, as they always do, the impact remained. Neighborhoods began auditing their HOAs. States introduced legislation tightening impersonation laws. Even training academies for security guards quietly updated their policies. But most of all, people started asking questions when someone in uniform showed up with orders and no credentials. And in that, there was something like justice. Bradley never spoke publicly again. He didn't return to the spotlight. He declined interviews, avoided the cameras. He didn't need to relive the worst day of his life over and over. But he did visit the monument every Sunday. Always at the same time, always alone. He would sit on the bench and just look ahead, eyes fixed on nothing, hands resting in his lap. Sometimes he brought flowers. Sometimes he didn't. He never smiled. But once, when a teenager passed by and nodded respectfully toward the plaque, Bradley gave a small nod in return. It wasn't peace, it wasn't healing, but it was something. And for the rest of the country, for every reader who had clicked the headline, followed the case, or shared the article, There was a collective sense of bitter satisfaction. The lie had been exposed. The truth had prevailed. But the price? The price would always be too high.